Okay, we're live. You can start if you want.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the ELLIS Against COVID-19 workshop. This is the 5th edition, and we still have a lot of interest in this topic, and hence we continue the series of the workshops. So let me briefly go over the organization. So we typically get requests and proposals for speakers and topics. We collect these. Daniela is collecting these, or the organizers are collecting these, and then we compile a workshop program like the one for today. The next edition for the NEURBS will be after the NEURBS deadline, likely on June 10th. That is right 1 week after the NEURBS deadline. So we are, I guess, all busy with the NEURBS deadline. So also NEURBS solicits COVID-19 contributions. There was a tweet recently by Raya about it. There will be they welcome papers on the use of machine learning to contribute to the understanding and the treatment and the prevention of COVID-19. So today we have the live stream again on YouTube. We have we have the speakers in Zoom. And we have an exciting program for today. We will have one session where we talk more about the organization of science in times of COVID. So we will have Neil talking about the DELF initiative, then Carl Johan talking about the initiative for remote conferencing participation, which is particularly important for in COVID times, and then Shakir with first-hand experience of organizing ICLR as a remote conference. And then we have three more speakers: Frank Noe, using machine learning and statistical mechanics for COVID host entry proteins; Andrea Thorn, Inside Corona, the coronavirus structural task force; and Mark Calmiano on the Moonshot project, searching for clinically effective COVID-19 antivirals. So, and as usual, we will have the 3 talks, and then we'll have a discussion after that. We collect the questions for the discussions in an online form. The link is on the bottom here. We can also post that in the YouTube channel. And yeah, so then I guess we can go ahead with the first session. So Bernard will share the session.
Thank you very much, Gunnar. I don't know if people can see me, but as long as you can hear me, that's the main thing. So my name is Bernhard Schölkopf. Very happy to introduce our first speaker. So we'll have 3 speakers in this session. We don't take questions right after the talk or during the talk, but you submit them online, and we have a question and discussion session at the end of that short session. First talk will be given by Neil Lawrence, who doesn't need an introduction, but for those outside of the field, Neil Lawrence is one of the most prominent machine learning researchers. He's a professor in the computer lab at Cambridge University. He's also quite a prominent public figure in machine learning, quite active in various respects, and currently heavily engaged in the DELF initiative at the World Society. And I think he'll tell us something about that in the next 15 minutes. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Great. Can everyone see the slides?
Yes.
I'm seeing some nodding heads, which is a good sign. So thanks very much, first of all, to ELLIS for this invite, and also for organizing this seminar series. I'm about to show you what I've been busy doing over the last few weeks, and I've joined ELLIS seminars when I can, but I know how helpful they've been across a wide range of people in this epidemic. It's a really good way of connecting and seeing the latest research. So the DELF initiative is what I'm going to talk to you about today. And the DELF initiative is a rapidly convened group by the Royal Society. This is what it stands for: Data, Evaluation and Learning for Viral Epidemics. I should say it might have been borrowed from a piece of work at the University of Toronto back in the 1990s, for those who remember. I was trying to think of a good name for the initiative because we were wondering about names, and they had such this great name, Delve, and it may have been reused a little bit there. So there's some machine learning history to our name. But I think the reason the name is so appropriate is because the initiative is really not necessarily trying to do new science. It does new science where appropriate, but it's much more about trying to look at the existing science and give the best understanding possible to UK government in terms of policy. So I don't know how many people know about how scientific advice is absorbed by UK government, but there's a group called SAGE, which is Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies. And the idea with Delve is that what we wanted to do was feed into that with techniques that were taken from data science and machine learning techniques, expanding to some modeling. So the SAGE group's main input is something called the SPIN, which is Scientific Pandemics Influenza, it stands for, modeling group. And that tends to be more mathematical biologists on the epidemiological side. So what Delve was initially looking to do was also provide a route for data science and also learnings from international situations to also feed into policy advice. Now, in the end, there's a few ways that I think it's differed. If you've done science in practice, you'll immediately follow what these ways are. It's actually very difficult to do data science and machine learning for deployed questions without really good domain expertise. And so the idea that you can just have people who understand data but don't understand domain answering questions is clearly not workable, and we understand that well. So actually, this initial remit has led to just a very multidisciplinary team, because once you sort of say, well, what are the things we're going to have to understand, you realize you need to cover all these different areas. So virology, immunology, epidemiology, economics, we've got behavioral scientists, all formed within the group. So the project has a particular structure which comes from the Royal Society is used to convening groups of scientists, but normally these groups of scientists will be reporting sort of over 2-year periods. There's actually, I was reading a bit about the history. There's a fascinating history with the Royal Society. It's founded in 1660, and sort of Newton's, I think that's the second or third president. But at one point, the Royal Society, the president of the Royal Society was the sort of government's chief scientific advisor. That's no longer the case. It's an independent society, and there are separate groups of government advisors, chief scientific advisors, who actually convene in the SAGE committee. But the Royal Society now does a lot of projects, some of which you may have seen. There was a machine learning project that was produced a few years ago, I think it's about 3 or 4 years ago. And those projects are providing general background to policy advice. So this is a slightly different thing for the Royal Society, because policy questions, for those of you who've been working closely with government, they're often asking questions which they'd like answers to, perhaps on the basis of a time frame of a week. In particular, they convene SAGE meetings to answer particular questions, and you may only know what those questions are going to be a week in advance. Now that makes it very difficult. So one of the things we're doing in a normal Royal Society initiative is you end up with something like a steering committee. And this is, in our case, the steering committee has people like Venki Ramakrishnan on it, who's the president of the Royal Society. It sort of has knights and lords and Nobel Prize winners and that sort of thing, but a really diverse group. So they're just they're technically very, very strong, but really great for networking. Our working group is what myself and Yi Tae were tasked with initially forming before we appointed a chair. And actually, again, it's quite high-powered scientists, statisticians as well, coming together to help feed our advice. The thing that I think UI and I were nervous about, so UI and I did the initial pulling of things together, is that actually we had to get data science done on the ground. So we invented the notion of what we're calling the action team. So the action team, the people in the group who are actually pulling the data together, they're also reading the papers, summarizing the papers, and bringing that information into one place. Now, it's quite hard to sort of get communication going rapidly across all such groups, particularly when you're trying to turn around things in a week. So the steering committee is meeting once a week, the working group's meeting once a week. The action team, we have action team updates that occur 3 times a week, but we're not sort of forcing everyone to turn up to every one. And the main activities really are occurring on Slack. And it's a diverse group of people from domains, different universities, who haven't known each other before this meeting. So actually bringing them together in relationships of trust has been really important. Now, getting communication going well through this is also really important. So you've got to make sure that the steering committee trusts the work that the action team is doing. The typical dislocation you get in a scientific scenario, and you see this again and again in academia. Academics, we all have opinions. We all have what we think people should be doing. And we're not actually that timid about sharing our opinions. We're perhaps sometimes reluctant to go ahead and do those things. Which is an interesting difference. I spent 3 years in industry. In industry, you don't normally say that stuff should be done unless you're willing to pick it up and do it yourself. Academics, we don't quite have those constraints. So what you want to make sure is that the action team that's doing the work has a really good, strong relationship with the steering committee and the working group. And the way we did that is the members of the action team are mainly nominated by the steering committee and the working group of people that they know who can deliver, who understand data and can deliver on answering questions and ego-free and will work well in a larger group. And that's been really, really important. I'd say one difference I've seen in the Delve initiative versus other initiatives, I think the natural instinct whenever you're launching an initiative in this space is to do what academics always do, which is to have a very large call for proposals for people who can help. That's great, we love that, but it doesn't really make it easy to form teams that are multidisciplinary and agile and can deploy on new questions very rapidly, because as soon as you've had an open call to do something, you have all these obligations around fairness of who's included and who isn't. Now, the Delve initiative is not giving anyone any funding. So in that sense, it's much more about who do we know who could help deliver a job and has some time on their hands, which is quite different from the normal approach. And that's driven by the very short time frame. So anyone on this call we would who has the right expertise, we're very happy to integrate when the relevant question comes up. We're not sort of limiting the scope of those we include. The other aspect of the Delve initiative that I think is quite important is what we call the supply chain of ideas. So it's very apparent in the epidemic that there's no shortage of people who think they have solutions to the problems that we're facing. The challenge is that the people who are in power and capable of delivering on those solutions are relatively few, and they're very, very busy. So there's something you tend to see quite a lot is, well, I don't understand why they don't just do this, where this is some solution. Well, the chances are that the person who's trying to make the decision may not even know about that solution because it's associated with a particular expertise. So with the Delve action team, we've really tried to focus on what we call the supply chain of ideas, which is we're not so much trying to generate new ideas ourselves. Sometimes we have to, where there's a gap in the knowledge or something that a model that needs creating or a data analysis that needs doing to answer a particular question. But mainly what we're trying to do is control the mapping of these ideas to the policy questions. So the policy questions are coming from government, civil service. They're also coming, we also raise our own policy questions within the group and from the steering committee and the working group. And the ideas are out there in the wider community. They're in this network. The people here have amazing ideas, great solutions. They're in other countries. And what we're mainly trying to do is deal with this bottleneck, which is that the mapping of the ideas onto the right solutions is the under-resourced area. Everyone likes to think that they're working on something that will solve things. There are fewer people who have the scientific capability to understand what the right solution is for a particular problem. And I think that this for me is extremely important because it's where things are missing. It's a difficult job, but it's not a job that many of us are trained to do. So I think there's this constant feeling, of being slightly uncomfortable that you're often having to stretch outside your usual domain of expertise. And to deal with that, we've really tried to make sure we bring together a group that's very open about their ignorance. So we stipulate when people join, you should be prepared to ask, in inverted commas, stupid questions. Very few of these questions are stupid, and you should be prepared to answer, in inverted commas, stupid questions. And of course, the result is that people start to find out things about other domains that they were afraid to ask, or people start questioning the assumptions in their own domain, because some of these, in inverted commas, stupid questions are very on point and pointing out, say, a major weakness in a particular way of thinking that isn't normally identified because we tend to silo within our scientific areas. So personally, I've really enjoyed watching that process and being involved where I am. So as I say, highly multidisciplinary, immunologists, virologists. The immunologists in particular, I think even amongst biologists, they're known for their sort of arcane terms and languages, but they're very lovely. You know, these are sort of world famous immunologists in the steering committee, but they're very open to explaining what they're doing. The virologists, the same. And one of the things that kind of really shocked me early on was the speed at which, when you got the immunologists together, that they were saying, well, coronaviruses don't typically have, you know, lifetime immunity associated with them. It tends to be typically, well, figures they were sort of mentioning, and we don't know what it is for COVID obviously yet, is sort of 18 months. And I just never heard that in the broader scientific conversation from the epidemiologists. All these things about herd immunity. We're not saying that the existing coronaviruses that are in the population tend to have this restricted immunity. And I think part of the reason is because people just weren't integrating the immunologists in their discussions. The other thing is having economists involved is super interesting, particularly when you start getting into domains like test, trace, isolate. There's a large number of things that are just impractical to do, and economists are really used to giving government advice, and they're used to understanding how you have to incentivize people and what things people won't do, and what the techniques are for getting, say, industries to adopt things. They are also, I think, amongst the most professional group, I would say, alongside statisticians, sharing their expertise within a wider group of scientists. I think because they're so used to doing it. Just my observation when you get these multidisciplinary meetings together, the economists always say something useful, you know, even if it's off their domain, and similar to the statisticians. Behavioral scientists as well. So the other aspect I've mentioned is, yeah, the avatar model, that the way we run our action team is we try and make sure that the person's doing the work is basically very closely trusted by someone on the steering committee or the working group and can represent their opinions well. So we're not having to constantly recommunicate with the sort of world famous scientists that are on the steering committee and the working group. We have channels of communication that are closer to the relationship between a PhD supervisor and a student. These aren't always PhD students. These are sometimes full professors, sometimes associate professors. And in fact, I love the diversity of our action team. It goes all the way from PhD students to full professors, just working on a very equal basis together. And the other characteristic that's in there is we do not reinvent the wheel. That's broadly it. I wasn't sure how fast I was going to go through things, so I'll just end briefly with some stuff on, these are some of the tools we use, what we've been working on so far. Yeah, I should say the software tools are extremely important. So we're using Trello and Slack to bring the team together, almost like a virtual institute, to ensure that we're managing to communicate with each other. And that's a massive advantage of this epidemic, is that everyone's in the same position. So we don't have those background conversations going on inside physical institutes that some of us are not party to. We're all party to the same conversations because everything's occurring on Slack. The work so far, what we've done is there's a public report on masks, which recommended that the UK government should be promoting masks as part of that solution. That's a recommendation accepted. Our test, trace, isolate report was given in last week, and it will be published on our website next week. There are several other reports on schools opening, immunology, overview of the immunology of the virus, sector opening, which sectors should be open first in terms of not propagating the disease, but maximizing the economic benefit, and better understanding the effects of social deprivation and lockdown. These reports are in process. Some of them we don't even have great scientific evidence for at the moment. Like I think on schools, it's very difficult to say what the effect is one way or another of opening schools at the moment. And immunology is still not that well understood, but we have ongoing projects on those things. And saving questions for afterwards, so I'll just stop there.
Thank you very much, Neil. So we move to the next speaker, and so maybe I'll say a few words while Shakir gets ready and starts sharing his slides. So Shakir Mohammed is he works for DeepMind as a scientist. He's I think one can fairly say he's one of the most prominent machine learning scientists at DeepMind. He's done a lot of fundamental work in probabilistic learning, representation learning, but also active in a number of other domains. And I think he's going to tell us about how conferences change in the age of pandemics like COVID-19, because he has firsthand experience with iClear. So thank you very much. We cannot hear you yet, Shakir. You seem to be muted.
Okay, hopefully it works now. Yeah, sorry.
Perfect.
Okay, good.
Yes.
So hopefully the screen is also shared in the poll. So yeah, thank you to everyone in the committee for having me here, and then also for choosing this great title, thanks to Diana, Conferences in the Age of the Pandemic. And I think it will sort of tie nicely with what Neil was just saying about how it is we are thinking about organizing science more broadly. And this is sort of one instance of how that's actually unfolding in one way. So for us particularly, I was the senior program chair for iClear, which is the 8th version, which happened this year. And we were going to be held in Ethiopia originally. And of course, all the changes going on, we had to move from this in person to a fully virtual case. And a lot of what makes that work, or what will need to happen, is then to recreate certain things, to give people the tools to actually understand and engage with a very different way of working and engaging with our conferences. So I want to just briefly tell you a bit of how we went about that process, what were some of the questions that came up, and then sort of what are the questions going forward for us a bit more broadly. And then I also want to link up to maybe a slightly larger kind of question. So of course, all of this is due to the work of an amazing team who gave a lot of effort and energy for over a 6-week period to bring everything together. And sort of something that Neil said to us earlier is one of the things that's so interesting and unique about the machine learning community and field is that we have so many skills. And actually, we can actually bring together, code up a whole website ourselves, bring all these different tools together, integrate them, and create really an experience that works for our communities in the way that we think they should work. So there were 2 principles that we used in designing the kind of virtual conference that we put forward. So the first one was that we needed to be inclusive. And what inclusive meant was that we needed to be asynchronous, even though it's asynchronous in the slides, so asynchronous, so that at any time zone across the world, anyone could engage. We wouldn't need to ask anyone to be awake at odd hours or to work in unhealthy hours, or if they needed to, for whatever reason, because of the current circumstances, or usually, they could create a time schedule that works for them. We also extended our live sessions. So in this case, where you usually have maybe 1 or 2 poster sessions a day, we had actually 5 poster sessions, which ran usually at 1 p.m. at time zones across the world. And so if you're at 1 p.m. in China, there would be a time zone, 1 p.m. in Berlin, there would be 1 p.m. in New York, there would be 1. And so everyone would have a lot of access to these things. And it needed to be globally accessible. So everyone needed to be able to use these tools, and we wanted to consider the cost. So questions around visas, travel, hotel fees, all these questions that we usually are tackling through other mechanisms in the physical conference, we wanted to also make sure were addressed in this case. The second kind of principle was one of interactivity. And many people recognize that one of the core features of our conferences is the fact that we do interact with each other. We are sharing each other's results, how it is we are working in our own experience. So we had to replicate many kinds of systems to create that. So there's a system of chat, which is everywhere in the virtual conference, and chat becomes that mechanism where everyone is there sharing ideas. We wanted to replicate certain kinds of face-to-face elements. We wanted to establish certain kinds of social events and social times, and to make it possible that we could self-organize to create other kinds of events if people needed them. So that meant, so I think I've been through some of these notes already. So we effectively customized a virtual conference, particularly to support the culture and needs. I think it became very clear early on that we have many different kinds of tools, but they all are separate, and to really create a good experience, we need to integrate them. And our solution was then to actually code up a system ourselves, and you can see the kind of heading bar that we use at the top here. So the integration of tools needed to be worldwide. So when we made a decision about the tool that would work in China and Iran and in Sudan and in London and in New York, that was the tool we chose in the end. And then of course, many of our conferences include the role of sponsors, because that is part of the connection that we are creating at our conferences. So we wanted to support the sponsors and their role, and then also to have a low cost, secure, scalable, have a very explicit data protections, to have a system that was intuitive, and ultimately to be something that was fun to play around. So this is just some of the numbers that we highlight. Usually we would have had around 3,000 registrations, but because of the virtual format, makes it so much easier. It was $50 for students to register. So we got quite a large number. We had 89 different countries. And then we had all these different tools which we were using to coordinate together. So in total, 1,336 speakers, around another 1,400 Zoom calls, which were all together, and lots of different engagements over chat, 100,000 different messages which were sent, people spending time at the conference booth and actually spending time on each kind of paper. So I'll just show you very briefly what it looked like. So the key difficulty is that now in the virtual space, you need a way to discover what these papers look like, where papers are, what they look like. So this is one system of navigation that we had, which was just a way of browsing every single paper by title, by keyword, by author, and you could view them in different ways, and they were actually randomized to give you that broader overview. And then there was sort of another view, which was this kind of visualization tool, which was basically a 2D projection, and you could, and clusters the kind of papers based on topic in different ways, and you could draw a little square around every section and then explore individual papers and create for yourself a new way of discovering. And there were a few other mechanisms around recommendation that appeared as well. This is what a typical paper page would look like. So every paper, to engage with it, looks like this. You have a summary at the top, which is the title, tells you the keywords, the abstract. You can access the paper from Open Review. You can see the code, see its reviews. There's a chat screen, which is embedded, which is a continuing conversation throughout the week, not just at the time of their poster session. All our videos were pre-recorded, and that was part of the asynchronous system. So you could watch it at any time, watch as many of those videos beforehand, and then make a decision as to when to join. And you can see the time. There were 2 live times that every speaker, every paper had, and you could just choose them when one of those matched with the time that worked for you. And then we had many different mechanisms for interactivity. So of course, the sponsors, and we had a sponsor portal that people could go to and then actually meet the sponsors, chat with them, talk about any opportunities they have for internships or full-time positions, or just generally their kind of work. The chat mechanism that I mentioned was everywhere and encompassed every element, including this page that I'm showing, which is a help desk. And over the course of the week, the number of questions which were asked on this help desk channel, where people are trying to get used to how this virtual format will dwindle to something like 30 on the last day. Then we had this kind of mentoring session, which actually emerged on its own, where people, senior scientists in our field, would just put a message on the mentoring channel to say, I'm free for 10, or at this time, here's a Zoom link, here's a call link, just join me, and people would join, and then we talk about career progressions, difficulties in research. I think that was a really powerful mechanism. And then you had other kind of people like Rich Sutton here, who created a social to talk around certain elements of scalability in RL. And that was really well attended. They had lots of fun, and you can see Kenya having a bit of a laugh there. And then we experimented with other kinds of tools, these 2-dimensional virtual environments that we called IKEA Town, where every person had an avatar. You could walk around, and when you came in close proximity to someone else, then your video would actually work. You'd be able to see them and speak to them, and if you walked away, you wouldn't be able to hear and see them. So I think there's many opportunities to play there. So some of the challenges which came on is that because we did everything in such a tight time frame, to communicate with people was one of the challenges. So earlier communication will generally will be useful because everyone needs to build an understanding of how these kind of systems work. The kind of technical infrastructure and how we support those kind of infrastructures in the long run is also something we need to think about. You know, we won't always have the right kind of technical skills on the team to bring that kind of tools together. And then, of course, when we work in the online space, because of things like trolling or Zoom bombing and various other ways of safety in online communities, which is itself a big research question, we needed to consider those questions of online safety. And so some of the other kind of interesting things and opportunities that came up, of course, we had a set of volunteers, around 500 volunteers. They were eager. They were the on-call helpers throughout the conference. They were in every time zone. They were really a highlight of the conference for us, and we are really grateful to all our volunteers. The posters themselves formed quite a challenge as us as organizers and also on the side of the authors of papers themselves. And I think one of the things we'll need to do here is just get used to a new way of communicating our science. And I think these online poster sessions can actually work really well once we actually all get used to it. You cannot enter the virtual poster session thinking that it will work the same way as the physical one. And so there's a bit of change for all of our side and a bit more experimentation. One of the, I think, the greatest opportunities that the virtual conference creates are these mechanisms for inclusion. Now, everyone across the world is included, whether they have children, accessibility, movement, they can access the portal, this kind of tool, when they can, in ways that they can. And I think we can do so much more going forward, thinking about people who have hearing impairments or visual impairments, autism spectrum, many other kinds of ways. I think the opportunities for inclusion just increase. The other kind of interesting thing that we did throughout the conference is that the virtual conference itself became an environment in which we could deploy the work of machine learning. So in that paper portal page, every paper had a thumbnail. We created a deep learning method which extracted automatically images from the papers that would be used there. That visualization system was built and creating an NLP system that looked at the nearest neighbors and visualized them in 2D. We had other recommendation systems that also work to consider questions of fairness and how we are recommending papers to people. We even, in the calibration of the system of the review scores, we had a latent variable model to actually help calibrate the score. So there's so many opportunities for us to use the work that we are publishing in our conference in the design of the conference itself. And I think we'll have to do a bit more calculation for all of us, but there are significant savings of having virtual conferences. From the flights, which are the obvious ones, but when we aren't at a conference space, we aren't creating the kind of waste that's associated, plastic and materials, coffee cups, running those spaces as well. So that's a really interesting one. And I think overall, there are many avenues for connection that are available to us already. And this entire experience just makes it clear how many of those avenues we have available and that we can actually experience them more. So of course, if you want to read a bit more about all of this, we wrote them up in the Medium post, and we actually had a really fun conversation with Neil and with Catherine Gorman and the Talking Machines podcast recently that you can listen to. I wanted to just end on my last slide just to sort of bring the reason why I am involved in all these kind of conference mechanisms is that they give us an opportunity to think about new ideas for foresight. And foresight is something that I'm trying to think about a bit more generally in an extended period of work that I've been doing. And I want to just tell you a little bit about that. So foresight methodologies in general are collections of efforts that help us anticipate how the choices and the actions we make today are either creating or shaping the future. And I think many of the things we are doing right now are doing that work of action and shaping that will impact the future. So the question that I've been trying to think about is, what are the tools of foresight that we need, and what are those missing and new tools that we can create? And I think, you know, we have the conference, which is one way, which is asking us very clearly, how is it to question how it is we are organizing our conferences and to think about the impact of the way that we are communicating our science. And when we do this, I think there are certain kinds of values which we are saying which are implicit. In our case, those values were inclusivity and accessibility. When we are doing a physical conference, there may be other kinds of values. And so what are those values? When we are doing this work of machine learning for COVID or machine learning for good, we are asking other kinds of questions of how it is we are equipping ourselves as a machine learning community to work in these spaces. Inevitably, there are going to be questions of benefit and how we judge these kind of things together. And I think together that means we need to do the work of foresight, again, to think about how these actions can shape the future. So I have two papers which I wanted to share with you. One, which is around this idea of AI for social good. And then to ask those questions, well, what is it that means for us to do good in practical kinds of terms? And then for us also to think about the kind of historical hindsight that we already have available as a machine learning community when we want to do this work of foresight and to equip ourselves to better handle situations like the one we are currently in. So maybe my provocation for discussion is for us to think about the larger question of foresight and technical foresight and technological and scientific foresight in this age of the pandemic. So again, thank you to my whole IClear team for their amazing work, and thank you to the whole ELLIS committee for having me. It's been really a pleasure to speak to you.
Thank you very much, Shakir, for this very thoughtful and thought-provoking presentation. So let's move to the last talk in this session, which will be given by Carl-Johan Simon Gabriel. So Carl-Johan, so there are multiple ways we've been discussing before what to call this session, and I think Gunnar found a good name for the session. We could also call it three super nice people talking about from the machine learning field, talking about issues that are not sort of core machine learning, but more about how to make the world a better place using machine learning. And Carl-Johan is going to talk about one such issue that Shakir has already alluded to. So the floor is yours, Carl-Johan.
Great, thanks a lot, Bernard. Thanks a lot for this very nice introduction. And thanks a lot, Shakir, also for this sort of longer introduction to my talk, essentially. Actually, it's more what happened after what I will explain here. Namely, what we did beginning of this year, or end of last year, beginning of this year, we were noticing a group, I and the group were noticing that more and more scientists actually really would like the possibility to present at conferences remotely. Typically, ML conferences publish talks online, but they require always the presence of one author in person. And I had this problem for a conference last year where I wanted to go. I actually couldn't go. I had a paper accepted, but couldn't go, or it was really associated with lots of problems. So I wanted to ask whether I could present remotely, and it wasn't possible, right? So that's how I got a bit annoyed, and I started talking about it with many Azure people. And in the end, we thought, well, why not make a petition about it and ask that conferences allow these remote presentations? The reasons, Shakir already mentioned them. I will just briefly mention them, some of them again. Of course, there's climate change. Every time you fly, you use a huge carbon budget. Typically, an intercontinental flight has approximately the average carbon budget of a European, yearly carbon budget of a European. You use it with one intercontinental flight. But there's other issues. Of course, there are all you avoid visa and travel ban issues, which particularly, well, right now and even before that, started to become more and more an issue for some citizens of some countries. You reduce costs, of course. You don't have to pay a flight. You don't have to pay conferences fees, or at least very less conference fees. And of course, it sometimes helps to improve life quality also. This affects particularly young parents or even pregnant women, which are not supposed to fly, which shouldn't fly. Actually, it's not when they are pregnant. So in a sense, it's for them it's really unfair if they have to go to the conference and cannot present remotely. And of course, there's the time benefits. You don't have to fly, right? And you don't have to be on. You can just log yourself in to do the remote talk, and you don't have to fly there and whatever. So we see that it's first of all, it's a fairness issue worldwide. I mean, in between men and women, between people with less or higher budgets or institutions with less and higher budgets. And it's also an intergenerational fairness. I mean, climate change is an intergenerational fairness stuff. And it's also a question of freedom of choice, right? Why can't we leave people free to choose whether they prefer to do it, to go to the conference, or to do it remotely? So who initiated this and what were the reactions? So original authors of this petition were Dominik Janczyk, Neil Lawrence, Bernhard Schölkopf, and Joshua Bengio, and myself, of course. And it was, so in a sense, it's very much tied to ELLIS, because I think all these authors are very closely related to ELLIS. I would say in general, I received many extremely positive reactions. Many people actually wrote me an email when they saw the petitions, thanking us and saying all the good they thought about it. And overall, I would say the petition spread to two communities mainly. It spread to the ML community. Actually, it was a bit written targeted towards the ML community, but funnily, it also spread a lot toward particle physicists, which in a sense are already a bit step further, because there typically you can actually go to conferences, or there are large conferences to which at which you can present without going there physically. Still, it spread there as well, and I had even a physicist, several physicists who wrote to me and asked how they could help to actually spread the news and spread this conference, this petition. Overall, right now we gathered approximately 4,000 signatures. This happened. The conference, the petition was launched beginning of February, and almost all those 4,000 petitions arrived in the first months. Right now, there's almost no new petition, no new signature. And it contains the name of many renowned scientists. Of course, I said it spread to two different, to the two communities, ML and particle physicists. So here is, for example, a non-exhaustive list of those people that signed it. Chances are that those names and those big names that you don't know are probably people from the particle physicists, which tend to have also lots of citations, actually, I noticed. So here's another version with only those that I classified as, or at least that my algorithm classified as ML people. So you will see there's probably you will recognize a lot of names. So I would say that overall the wish was for this for conferences to allow these remote presentations was very big in the community, and very big also amongst the leaders of this community, which was pretty funny because the conferences, though they weren't actually so happy about it. Some of them, so what we did is we contacted after 1 month or so, when we had gathered some roughly, let's say 2,000 or 3,000 signatures, we contacted the main, among the main ML conferences, NeurIPS, ICML, iClear, UAI, AAAI, AI Stats, and simply asked whether it would be possible to just give this opportunity, this option to leave this option to authors, and make sure that there is a technical support for that. It had already been discussed at NeurIPS, in the NeurIPS board, in the iClear board, and of course we had help because we had lots of insiders in these boards among the original authors also. And for some conferences it worked very well. For example, iClear very quickly said, yes, we will do it. And even as we all know, they very quickly even moved towards this completely online solution, helped by COVID, of course, but they did it before sort of COVID spread a lot, before the peak of COVID, I would say. And a few other conferences actually deferred. They said it's a nice idea, but we won't do it this year, and maybe years afterwards. Didn't know. It felt a bit like wasn't sure whether this was happening, despite lots of lobbying on our side. Then, of course, COVID-19, of course, is not a nice thing, but at least for that, it helped a lot. And suddenly all conferences moved or tried to think about online solutions. So that was a positive aspect. So now what? I think the main thing that we should target is that we preserve the changes that were induced by the positive changes, let's say, that were induced by COVID-19. And I think preserve at least the possibility to present paper and posters remotely. I think that's the least thing. But when I go back, if I go back to the climate change issue, just to give sort of a bit an idea of the size of the effort that we're supposed to do. So if we want to stay below the 2 degrees increase of the average worldwide temperature, which is what the utmost limit of the Paris Agreement, and then that means that we need to reduce our emissions by 4 to 5% every year for the next 30 years. 4 to 5%. Okay, you may think, that's not so much. Well, actually, the emissions are directly related often to our inner product. And if our inner product goes down, emissions goes down. And especially during this COVID crisis, our emissions went down. How much did they go down? Something between 4 to 8% over a year. That means that if we are really serious about staying below an increase of 2 degrees, we need one additional COVID every 1 to 2 years. So every 1 to 2 years, we need an additional COVID crisis so as to get this 4 to 5% less emissions, or at least that's the equivalent.
And I think we need a lot of additional time, unless you come.
Okay, so the thing, so all I wanted to say with this is, I would be a good. Actually, I think that if we are really serious, we should pretty much stop flying for holidays, stop flying for conferences, and even if I may formulate it hardly, stop flying to see families. That is because we decided to live on the other side of the world. Because one flight is more than what we can emit in 1 year, or that we are allowed to emit in 1 year. That's why I think we should definitely try to preserve the changes induced by COVID concerning these remote presentations and try to push it even further. And I was very, very happy to see what a great job was done at iClear, and thanks also to Shakir. Great, that's all for me. Thanks. If you didn't do it, sign and share still, and because we will need that afterwards to still push on conferences to say, yes, people still want this possibility.
Thank you very much, Karl-Johan, for this passionate and important message. So we are running a little late, but I suggest we still take a few questions and then maybe start the next session 5 minutes late, because I think the second discussion session is a bit longer than the first one. So we have a little bit of slack, but it would be a pity not to take any questions. So I'll start with an online one. So this one goes to Shakir. And this one, the question is, do you think conferences can keep registration fees low, meaning below $100, when sponsorship amount also drops to reflect a virtual event compared to a physical extravaganza, since many top venues are still barely decreasing fees compared to the high discount that we're seeing at iClear?
Hopefully you can hear me again. I think the question of the cost of conferences is actually the practical issue of also just picking up on the previous topic of how to create these kind of hybrid formats, because we have physical spaces that need to be paid for in advance, and everyone else here who sits on these boards and is actually doing the logistics, there's quite a big challenge, between how it is we do that. So I'll leave aside this question of how we manage the finances of this sort of hybrid format. But I think in general, the virtual format, we can actually, even with the format that we had, pay almost entirely through the registration at the levels that we had or slightly higher. So I'll give you some example of that. We had to use a lot of Zoom calls. Zoom can actually be pretty expensive depending on the kind of licenses that you need. And you may need up to 2,000 of these kind of licenses, webinars versus others. We also have to pay for the service of the chat facility, and that also comes at the cost of our back end of support. There's also the service for the video conferencing, but all of that together could be something around $300,000, depending on how you're managing the kind of budget in the end. So, you know, if we have the right numbers of scale, we can actually do it. So there's a bit of questions for all of us on these boards of ICML board and the NeurIPS board and ICML, how we actually balance these things. But I do think it is possible. And also we have the time and opportunity now by working with all our different cousin conferences together to share a lot of infrastructure between us. And if we did that kind of shared infrastructure, then we'd also create a more consistent experience between us across the field. We can ask these kind of questions of what values we are thinking are important. We can share costs, and then we can also help manage these kind of cost issues. So I think this is sort of one of the biggest questions for all of us who are now practically dealing with it, but I'm committed to thinking about this much more in both hybrid formats and fully virtual, that we keep these costs down, particularly because when you meet the people who come, who could never have come before, that is the thing that really lifts your soul in some sense. The young kind of students who are coming from Iran, or who you've met from Sudan, or even in South Africa where I'm from, who you get to speak to, would never be able to come any other way. So I think there was really, for that reason alone, we should be committed to figuring that out.
Maybe speaking as one of the organizers of this workshop here, one should also say to people who have never organized a conference, organizing an online conference is actually much easier than organizing a physical conference. The entrance barrier is very low, so you should just think about whether you want to organize something. Anyway, so the next, I have one more online question that I'll ask to Neil, and maybe meanwhile people who are here in the chat room or in the Zoom room can think about an actual a live question that I'll ask afterwards, or that they can ask afterwards. So this question goes to Neil. And the question is, are the questions that you deal with in the Delft group public? And if yes, can experts come to you to help to answer them? Or is it limited to the network of people that you already have?
They're not public, but oddly, they're not like secret either. I sort of shared some of our thinking today. It's a really great question, because one of the challenges in the whole supply chain of ideas is if you open it up too much, then managing that supply chain gets totally overloaded. But of course, we would love to bootstrap the expertise of everyone across the community. So we haven't made a public list, because I think that almost would turn into an advert where we would get a lot of interest. But if people have specific things that they're interested in contributing, really feel free to email me, and I can see how we can stitch them in. Because it's not like, I mean, the questions we're looking at are all the things you would guess. There's nothing particularly surprising.
Thank you very much, Neil. Yeah. So do we have a question here in the room? I think
maybe for me, yeah. So I have two questions, maybe, or one question to Shakir. So did you need to develop a lot of customized software to organize a conference, or was it essentially Zoom and I don't know what you used, Slack or so for chat, or did you need to integrate a lot of, well, developing a lot of new stuff, which costs a lot of money, maybe? Yeah, so maybe that's one question.
Yeah, so yeah, in addition to sort of, you can buy those licenses to each of these individual tools, they alone are not enough to create a meaningful conference experience. So actually everything else, we coded ourselves, and actually mainly due to the work of two people, Sasha Rush and Hendrik Strobel, who actually wrote the code that integrated every single thing on that website. And the reason we chose certain kinds of tools was that they were easy to embed into the website. So we used a tool called Rocket Chat that was particularly easy to embed, but also we wanted to control the data ourselves and to think about questions of privacy and who has access to data and where those things are seen, to respect the data of people. So actually we had to write a lot of custom software, particularly because we also as a community have a certain kind of cultural expectation about how we want to engage with papers, the tools we have available. So
do you consider making that software available to the communities for other conference organizers? Did you consider that?
Yeah, so all of that code that we use is already available publicly. It's an open source repository. I think Sasha and Hendrik are actually working on a slightly cleaned up version of it, what they're calling mini-conf, which you can actually do. And actually any of us on this call and on the stream, it's pretty easy for ourselves to reproduce, because in the end, if you have your data from your conference, a list of papers in a CSV file, you can write a script that just converts that to a markup file, and then you have just a thing that runs in the end, generates a set of static web pages. And then those are the web pages that everyone engages with. And that's also the reason you want to have static, at least in this case, was that it makes it very clear that it's reliable. You know, static web pages don't require scalability issues and concerns around big things, the internet collapsing. So even if you had 10,000 people, it wouldn't actually die in that sense. So yeah, all of this is available. I can point everyone to it afterwards. I'll leave a comment on the YouTube channel where people can look at it and play around with it themselves. I will say there's sort of one benefit of iClear, which may be not possible in other conferences, which is part of the work we need to think about, which is scale. I think something very different needs to be done for smaller conferences, a conference that may have 100 people or less, and a different kind of mechanism for an in-between conference. And of course, the one we did works very well because we are very large, operates across the globe, has people at every time zone. But if we are just, operating in Central European time, I think there are different things we can do around that. So that's sort of more where things need to happen as well.
Yeah, that's great.
So I would like to thank all speakers again, thank the audience, encourage them to sign Karl Johann's petition. And I think this was a fascinating session, very different from what we had so far, but actually I think it nicely illustrated that this is a very broad problem. It's not just about finding drugs and writing contact tracing apps. So very much, thank you very much for this broad perspective. And I will hand over to Gunnar again, who will chair the next session. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Yeah. Oliver couldn't come, so I'm chairing the second session. So we will start, we have 3 talks. We'll start with Frank Noy. Frank Noy is a group leader in Berlin, working on deep learning, statistical mechanics, and he will talk about machine learning, statistical mechanics, and COVID-19 host entry proteins. Please.
Thanks, Gunnar. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay. All right, does that work? The slides? All right. Okay, so thanks a lot for the introduction and putting this conference together and having me. So I will talk about our efforts in early stage or preclinical drug development, or also how to understand the effect of possible drugs that may be effective against COVID. And so this is our group, it's the AI for Science group. So we are working on the interface between AI, machine learning, and the sciences, and in particular, machine learning and in particular, physical and chemical sciences. And so currently, fitting to the last session, this is how we look like. And so yeah, normally what we do is relatively fundamental physics plus machine learning stuff. So we attack problems like, for example, the sampling problem in statistical mechanics, or the electronic structure problem in quantum mechanics. And then we are developing machine learning methods that have certain physics built in, certain invariants or equivariances or symmetries, for example, or we let the physics define the learning problem. And so we're really working on this interface. But in our COVID project, everything is different, because we don't have a lot of time to do very fundamental research, and time is of the essence here. So we're trying to be very pragmatic, and this is a very applied project. So it's a little bit unusual for what the group usually does, but it's very exciting nevertheless. And so what we are interested in is the development or also the understanding of possible inhibitors that that could be drugs against COVID. So that could somehow make the disease more mild or prevent the bad results of the disease. So it's not has nothing to do with vaccines. It's really about drugs that treat the disease once it is there. And specifically what we are looking at is virus host entry. So the virus cannot replicate itself. So viruses basically need to hijack human cells and the replication mechanism of human cells in order to reproduce themselves. So they have the human cells basically make the viral proteins and assemble the virus and thereby multiply. And the first step of that, so a requirement for the virus, is to be able to enter the cells. So SARS-CoV-2 enters airway cells, and it uses this quite well-known spike protein, which is on its surface. That is what's forming the corona in some sense, in order to trick the ACE2 receptor. That is a human protein, which is basically a gatekeeper protein. So it's the point of entry where anything that wants to enter the cell basically has to show an ID and say, I want to come in, can I come in please? And then the virus here tricks this protein into believing that it's allowed to go in. And again, a necessary condition for that is that the virus first interacts with another protein, which is called TMPRSS2. That's a protease, so a protein that can cleave other proteins. It can cut the amino acid chain of other proteins, and it will make a cut in the spike protein. And this cut is necessary for the spike protein to be activated, and it can then enter. So if you can block any of these interactions, you can prevent the virus from entering, or you can reduce the virus load, at least in cells, and slow down its reproduction. Another interesting fact is that blocking this TMPRSS2 protein, and this is what we're trying to do, may not only help against SARS-CoV-2, but it also helps against other coronaviruses, such as SARS-1, but also influenza. So it could actually have other uses. So the first step in order to design a drug rationally is to have a structure. So it's very, very useful if you know what is the three-dimensional structure of the protein that they are trying to inhibit. So unfortunately for this protein here, this TMPRSS2 protein, we don't have an experimental structure. We don't have an X-ray structure, which is usually the main source of structural information. So one alternative is to do protein structure prediction, and there are many methods to do that. For example, we can do a homology model. So that basically means we take a similar protein and try to map the new sequence of TMPRSS2 onto the structure of the similar protein, or we use structure prediction programs. And one issue with that is, or one limitation with that is that proteins don't really have only one structure. So this is a movie of made by a colleague of mine. This is from John Kodera's group. And this shows the molecular dynamics of another protein, not our protein, at room temperature. So you can see how much movement and how much flexibility is in these proteins. So when you design a drug, you want to design a molecule that binds to one of these structures. It's very useful to not only have one structure, but to have a whole ensemble of structure, because basically you want to build something that binds not only to one of these structures, but multiple structures, or does well on average. Average in the sense of in this statistical average with respect to this statistical ensemble, which is defined by this energy here. And this energy is something that we have models for in molecular dynamic simulations. So another approach to do this, to generate an ensemble, is to use generative machine learning. This is something that is being explored quite recently only. In this case, we have a target energy which defines a target distribution that we want to sample. So we can use concepts like normalizing flows and combine them with reweighting of the generated distribution to the target distribution. And that is then called Boltzmann generators. But this is still in its infancy and it's not quite ready for the problem that we want to solve here. So what we're doing here is really to take our protein, make a homology model, and that is useful in this case because we have very similar proteins. For example, trypsin is one of the proteins that we have in our digestive systems that is very similar to this protease, and this is something we have structures for, and also other proteases we have structures for. And then what we do is we do high throughput molecular dynamics simulations. So we simulate many copies of the system. And we do that in an iterative way using an active learning procedure where we plan new simulations based on a model that we update and build while we run the simulation so as to be statistically efficient and to overcome the rare transition events between different structures. And then using a lot of data, we built these Markov state models. And for that, we again use a deep learning method called VAMPNet, which is essentially learning a latent space in which it is easy to classify the different states that are relevant for protein structures. And we build a Markov chain. We estimate a Markov chain between these states. And this is a result that we get. So these states here in the middle and the arrows between indicate a Markov chain between 5 long-lived states. So these are sets, each of these states are sets of protein structures which are long-lived, in which a typical trajectory stays for a long time. And what you see in these other pictures are different structures in which a structural biologist would see that in some of them the catalytic structure, so what makes the protein function, makes it being a protease, is actually disrupted. So these are actually structures you really want to stabilize, and other structures that are active you want to inhibit. So you want to put an inhibitor there, which basically blocks these from binding the virus protein, the S protein, the spike protein. And so this is a very useful starting point in order to develop drugs now. So now how can we develop drugs? So there is a whole science of machine learning from chemistry that I won't talk about in detail. It's something we have heard in an earlier ELLIS for COVID meeting. And so there's quite some research on how we can represent molecules, how we can learn latent spaces, encoding relevant chemical structures and make predictions from them, for example, about toxicity, solubility, synthesizability of a molecule. What we want to do here is we want to develop a drug that specifically binds to a certain protein. And that is still a quite open problem in machine learning. And the problem really here is that we have very little specific data that would sort of combine molecular structures for a given protein with properties of a certain inhibitor based on which we could train on. So this is something that is not easy to do. What is doable is we can team up with an experimentalist, and that's what we are doing. They set up an assay where they can probe, let's say, a few hundred of drugs on this particular protein that we're interested in and see if they bind. And then we can do some semi-supervised learning with established methods and then use these relatively few data points in order to make useful predictions. And so last slide is, so since we are on a relatively short time scale, we cannot really bet on the track of developing a completely new drug, which usually takes like 10 to 15 years to go through a successful clinical trial and also a few billion euros or dollars of investment. Maybe the money is there at the moment, but we don't have the time. So the much more promising thing on the short run is to use existing drugs and to try to show that they work for this particular disease. And for these two drugs, nafamostat and camostat, these are available on the Japanese market, and they have been experimentally shown to inhibit this protein that we're interested in here. So what we can now do is, again, do simulations and machine learning models and explain how they work. And based on these models, we can also explain that why nafamostat binds better than camostat, why this is a more efficient drug. And this, again, might be a starting point for developing something that is even more efficient or more specific to this protein, so has less side effects because it acts less against other proteins, or identifying existing drugs that have those properties. And yeah, finally, then the next step is to go to experimental tests and actually validate that the proposed drugs work. And then next step is animal models, clinical trials, etc. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say. Thank you for your attention.
That's great. Thanks a lot. So we will have questions later. So please submit your questions via the online form. So for now, we start with a second talk in the session by Andrea Thorn. Andrea Thorn is a group leader at the Rudolf Virchow Center in Würzburg, a Center for Integrative and Translational Bioimaging. And I'm looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much for having me here. I'm going to talk about the Coronavirus Structural Task Force inside Corona. So here on the title slide, you can see a picture of the virus, the bilipid membrane, the spikes, and all of these things that you see here are actually molecules. Now, the virus, as it is usually depicted, only shows the transport form, the virus particle. But once a host cell is infected, the virus produces a lot more molecules, in total about 29 different types of biological macromolecules, most of them proteins. They form the hull, the spikes, the replication machinery that makes more viruses. Here you can see a depiction of the main protease. You can also see a potential drug bound to this molecule, which would inhibit its function. Here is another picture of the spike. So in order to, as Frank just lined out, rationally design drugs, we need to know these structures. And that is what we as structural biologists usually do. We use 3 different methods: X-ray crystallography, nuclear magnetic resonance, and cryo-electron microscopy to elucidate molecular structures. In this case, the structures of SARS-CoV and SARS-CoV-2, which are very similar. SARS-CoV-2 is the current Covid-19 causing virus. But there's a problem with this, and that is our workflow. So first we biologically prepare the protein or the macromolecule and purify it. Then no matter what's the method, NMR, cryo-EM, crystallography, we do a data measurement. And then this data measurement is interpreted with a structural model in the computer. So the model that you see, the balls and sticks, are not the direct outcome of the measurement. They are merely a model that is interpreting these data. And the fit is usually not so great. If we go by our values in crystallography, a typical fit would be about 75%. So if the model resembles the data to 75%, we think that's good enough for publication and interpretation. And very often this is true, and it gives answers to our biological questions. But there are also downstream methods like in silico drug screening, any kind of drug discovery, bioinformatics, chemoinformatics, and of course, machine learning applications. And even with like biological questions alone, we sometimes get ligands like this one. If you are a chemist, you may notice that the geometry is not quite beautiful. And sometimes we publish structures and they get on the cover of Science, but because the model wasn't right, the article has to be retracted. So a structure can even be completely wrong. And that is just a matter of fact in our world, that structural biology does not always produce exactly right structures, but there are errors in it, and this happens even in the best labs. So what can we do? Now, add to these problems the following, right? As scientists who are working on coronavirus, we currently get a lot of pressure to be super fast in discovering a cure. This exacerbates the problem, and while the structural biology has swung into action very quickly, we're very efficiently dealing with this, everyone's working together, it's great, we still may produce errors, and these errors may hinder downstream finding a drug. So as early as in February, I felt we needed to do something about this. And I started to look into structures, and I've quickly found colleagues like Tristan Kroll who looked into RNA polymerase, who did the same thing. And this is just an example. RNA polymerase has been known from SARS-CoV-2. The structure is a high impact, important structure. The RNA polymerase makes more genes. So if the RNA polymerase cannot make more copies of the RNA, new viruses can't have new RNA, and no new viruses can be produced. So stopping this molecule would mean having a potential cure. However, the structure that had been deposited, and actually every RNA polymerase structure ever since the first one, so 7 or 8 structures, had the same problem with Tristan Kroll illustrates in this video of his software Isolde. There was a 9 residue out of register shift. Oh, it does not play. That's too unfortunate. And you would usually see here the shift of 9 residues, so the whole molecule changes its conformation as you see the error. This structure also contains a number of wrong magnesium ions and free disophosphate that we think there's no experimental evidence for. And adenosine had been modeled backwards. There were 2 prolines which were ought to be cis and a few waters missing. So we added all of these and offered the structure back to the original authors as a corrected structure to deposit. And they, luckily, I think, reversioned their file. So this is what we do. And we quickly became a bigger team. We called ourselves the Coronavirus Structural Task Force because we looked at those 500 known structures from coronavirus. These are some of our members. We are by today 15 people from 7 different nations. All of us are methods developers in structural biology, meaning we're specialists in solving structures. Usually we develop the software that people use to solve their structures. We aim to validate the existing structures and the new ones that come up every Wednesday, improve them manually where possible by re-elucidating the structure solution process, looking at the models and comparing them to the experimental data, then disseminate these models back to the original authors and to the scientific public in a GitHub repository. And we also try to put the structures into context for people who are new to coronavirus. For example, drug developers that were focusing on HIV and are now coming into the coronavirus field. We do this on a homepage, insidecorona.net. We also have some information there for the general public about how all of this works. And we have a repository and database of our validation results and structures, plus a small SQL database for the metadata, which can be found on GitHub. We also use, like many scientists now, Twitter. And if you're really bored, you can also watch us on Twitch while we work on structures. One thing that I wanted to quickly mention, one of the things that we do for validation is the software HARSpecs, which is a neural network and can interpret reconstruction maps from cryo-EM, like this one from the spike head, by secondary structure. So it can differentiate the reconstruction maps even before you have a model into what is helical and what is beta sheet. And I'm rather proud of this because the paper only came out like last week. So I wanted to quickly show this to you because also ELLIS is all about machine learning. And we're using this now as well to experimentally determine our structures. This is the homepage. Important sections are news, where you can find blog entries that line out different important topics, and for users, which is a section for downstream users. So this is the news section. We put online about 3 articles per week. We also invite guest contributions. and for users is a bit more technically and helps people to decide which of the 500 structures is the right one that they want to use for their question. We have a lot of downstream users, individual labs who email us sometimes. Sometimes we don't know about them. Sometimes we only learn about them when they have a problem and they contact us. Folding at Home uses our structures as the basis for their 2.4 exaflops, 1 million PC computer power. MOL SSI is a simulation and drug discovery homepage that directly binds into our repository to pull the data. 3D BioNotes and of course the Joint European Disruptive Initiative has started a big challenge where labs can win money for discovering the best drug. And these groups are also encouraged to use our data as a starting point. Of course, we're very happy to hear from you, just in case you want to use our data as well. And we're very happy to guide new users on how exactly to use the repository and try to answer their questions as far as we can. Now, what's the outlook of this? We would like more automatic validation and graphics. We still haven't, I think we're not at capacity to what we could do in terms of automatic validation. However, we are at capacity with personnel right now. We are looking to have a better interface from the homepage to the results. So a 3D view of the molecules, for example, would be nice. We are writing to individual structural authors for the raw data, because that permits us to have the whole structure start to finish validated. And it's really valuable for us. It's a big argument that images should be deposited, but it's not universally standard in our community. So we're pushing for that, and we write to authors individually, and we also offer to deposit raw data for them. We also would like to have more insight into the virology of this virus. So we still would like to know more experts on coronavirus, because we are structural biology methods developers. And I think we would extremely profit in our oversight of the whole process and also in our blog posts if we could give more context. Future plans also include community-driven animation together with the IWASA lab. So we hope to make an animation of, for example, the virus entry, where then scientists can annotate inside the video, inside the animation and say, right, this bit isn't right, look at that paper. And we termed this using internet rage for annotating things. And we would still like more context for structures. Now, at the moment, I'm also looking for student helpers for this project and a PhD candidate. So if you're interested in joining us, I can only hire student helpers from Germany at the moment due to regulations, but PhD students from all over the world, please contact us.
That's great. Thanks a lot for the very interesting talk. So please, to the audience, please ask your questions online via the form. For now, let's move on to the third talk and last talk in the session. So we will have Mark Calmiano from UCB, and he will talk about the Moonshot project, searching for a clinically effective COVID-19 antiviral. Please go ahead. Thanks a lot, Andrea.
Okay, thank you very much. And thanks to ELLIS for allowing me to talk at your workshop today. So yeah, my name is Mark Calmiano. I work for UCB. So I'm a computational chemist. So I'm not really a machine learning specialist, but I dabble in machine learning a little bit. But my main role is working computational chemistry. My aim today is to introduce you to the Moonshot project and give you a few pieces of information of what the Moonshot project is doing and how you can access the information that is available to you via various websites, and how you can also contribute into the project if that's something that would interest you. So the first thing to say about Moonshot is that it's a publicly open project. So all the data and chemical structures that are put into the project are publicly released, so everyone is aware of those structures, and all the data, compounds that are synthesized, biological data that's generated that comes out of the project is also published as well. So everything is publicly available. And UCB is currently contributing voluntarily some medicinal chemistry resource and also computational chemistry resource to the project. So the Moonshot project's aim is really defined as developing a clinically effective antiviral quicker than has been done before, by really harnessing the power of the crowd and bringing together scientists and industrial scientists from academia and industry to tackle this virus issue. So as the Moonshot project is open to the public, I thought I would try and give the presentation today using the resources and websites that are available to you. So I can share some of the resources that you can access if you were interested in finding out more about the project, or if you wanted to contribute anything into the project. So as I share my screen, I'll go through a few of the websites that kind of give us the key information and background to the project. So we'll start off with this website here. This is the Postera website on the Moonshot initiative. So interesting that Moonshot isn't mentioned on this, but this is kind of the main portal into the project. So Moonshot essentially came into being based on the crystal structure of the SARS-CoV-2 main protease MPRO, which was solved by a group of Chinese scientists earlier in the year. And MPRO is thought to play a critical role in virus replication and transcription. When this structure was released, this triggered a huge crystal-based fragment screen at the UK's Diamond Light Source X-ray crystallography facility, where they initiated fragment-based crystallography on an XChem set of fragments. And if I go to the Diamond website, this is a good source of information for what Diamond did, and also gives some background to the structural elements of the project. So Diamond essentially launched an experiment where they looked at 1,500 fragments against the MPRO protein, and they were able to solve, I think, initially 71 fragments, both covalent and non-covalently bound fragments. And they published all the data associated with that crystallography screen on the website. So this is quite a good source of information for looking at binders and non-binders in terms of the fragments to MPRO. They also have all the downloads to the crystal structures that were solved of the fragments, both covalently bound and non-covalently bound to MPRO, and all the structures that are coming out of Moonshot, so compounds that are designed, synthesized, and then put into crystallography and produce crystal structures are also uploaded into this Diamond website, so you can download PDBs from this site. Another source of information that can be useful is the Fragalysis site, which is also supplied by Diamond. So this is a 3D visualization of the crystal structures that have been solved by Diamond. So you will see that there are all the crystallographic constructs that Diamond have worked with, the initial fragment crystal structures from the initial fragment screen, and also the compounds that are being synthesized and solved from the Moonshot project. So on the screen here, you'll see one of the compounds that was designed from the crowd, that was uploaded into the Moonshot, was synthesized, tested, is weakly active in the protease assay, and Diamond managed to solve a crystal structure of this compound in the MPRO structure, which then feeds into subsequent design cycles to try and optimize the molecules. So going back to the front page of the Postera website, on this page there is a design input. So people are encouraged to use the fragment and crystal structure data that is being produced at Diamond to inspire design ideas they can input into the project. We're not completely restricted just to fragment-based inspiration for ideas, but any inspiration for an idea that would inhibit the MPRO protein can be uploaded via this tool, so people can sketch in their ideas, submit, fill in some details about themselves and the rationale behind their design, submit that into Moonshot, and that gets picked up as a source of compounds. And to date, I think there have been over 5,000 ideas submitted into the Moonshot project through this crowdsource platform. There's also some activity data that you can view here. So all the compounds that are synthesized and then go into the primary assay are reported with the IC50s and the dose response curves. So you can get feedback on which compounds were synthesized and which ones have been tested in the assay. And there's also a list of the structures in 2D as well that have been worked on in crystallography. And beyond this, there are also GitHub repositories and Dropboxes that also contain data and files that are also available that you can get information on. And another good source of information here is the discussion forum. So from the main page, there's a discuss button. If you go into there, you will see a discussion forum where a lot of discussion and ideas are shared through this forum. So, for example, in the design forum, people have looked at different computational applications to looking for inhibitors for MPRO, submit their ideas and computational methods, results, input files into the forum to share with other users, to share their experiences, to learn from each other. So if anyone had a new computational approach that they wanted to try on MPRO, they could submit it into the forum and share that their ideas and results of any calculations they've done here, and that all gets picked up by the Moonshot project and reviewed alongside all the compounds as we try and optimize compounds through the design cycles to move to more potent inhibitors of MPRO. So I think I'm going to leave it there, but just to say that the forum is a good portal for people to get involved. But also, obviously, if you want to contact me through the website, there's contact information there if you want more information on Moonshot. But I think I'll leave it there and move to the questions at that point. So thank you for listening.
Thanks a lot. Great. Great initiative. Okay, so we have a few questions. So we take questions for Frank, Andrea, and Mark. I collected a few that are online. Maybe let me start with the first one here. So I was wondering, as a question to Frank, did you look at other protein drug combinations than the ones you talked about, or could you look at all combinations of the proteins which are, let's say, likely to be involved with all approved drugs, or is this computationally just too expensive to do that? Of the interactions, right? So
yeah, so we have not. We have focused on this particular protein, and the background of that is, honestly, I have been trying hard to stay out of doing anything for COVID-19 because there are so many people trying to do something at the same time, and it's really very hard to do something deep unless you're already in the business. And this particular protein is very similar to one that we have worked a lot on in the past, and we have an experimental collaborator who can test this in the lab. So I think based on this, we're in a position to do something that makes sense. I would be very cautious to just take a random protein, especially given that many of those don't have structures yet. Run some machine learning algorithm and propose some drug unless you have this connection to people that can actually make and test these things. So in that sense, I think this Moonshot project, for example, is a great initiative. But that again, is my understanding is on a particular target, on the viral protease, right? So yeah, so we haven't done others than this particular protein.
Okay, good, thanks. I think there was a question by Shakir. Maybe you want to ask it online.
Hi, yeah, thanks. My question is for Frank. I really like the element of your talk in that it shows just how many interesting questions for machine learning research comes out from this work of chemistry and biology coming together. In particular, you mentioned the role of generative models that appeared in many places, whether they were normalizing flows for densities or unnormalized models to deal with the Markov chain transitions, or later on GAN models to do different kinds of synthesis. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about where you see the failures of those models coming up right now in the spaces that you are looking at. I know you showed a clip of one of your recent papers, but and just sort of the avenues for new research that sort of have been coming up, that where we need to do more work in generative models research, which is coming up from the kind of applications that you're looking at. Thanks again for the great talk.
So in general, I would say the challenge that we have here is kind of so the way the generative models are usually used in machine learning is you have a large data set which defines the distribution that you would like to learn and sample from. And we are often in the opposite situation. So often we have something like unnormalized density or an energy model, and we would like to explore and sample it. So we need to be able to explore. And that is, so you have to somehow combine this with some sort of adaptive exploration algorithm or some simulation algorithm, maybe guide MCMC by generative models, etc. And also, I mean, our data is also very high dimensional, and they are often very, very multimodal. Yeah? So you have different probability modes that are separated by low probabilities. And I've found that actually many existing generative models have a lot of problems with that. And also in generative, in the flow work we have done, we find that many architectures really prefer unimodal results. So either smearing over all of the modes or just collapsing to one mode, depending on which version of the KL, forward or reverse KL, you train with, for example. So I think there is a lot of issues with discovering new modes in for given densities, unnormalized densities, and accurately representing multimodal distribution in high dimensional spaces.
Okay, I have two questions which are related to Andrea. So the first one is, do you have any ideas, proposals for a stronger collaboration between your group and the machine learning community? And the second one, pretty related, do you have any challenges or data sets that machine learners who are not experts in protein structures can work on?
Yes, so the first thing is, of course, that our data are rather suitable as training data for machine learning, no matter what your question is. If it's like applied structural biology, at least here you would get a few structures that have been vetted, and that might be a well annotated set of training data. The other side of this is that my lab is also looking into, as I shown, neural networks and machine learning methods for validating structures. And I think there is a lot to be had. In an ideal world, one day we would even be able to have part of the modeling itself, which currently still has to be manually because the discrepancy is so big, done by artificial intelligence, at least in part, because some of these modeling tasks and some of these errors could well be found by some kind of three-dimensional annotation or pattern recognition algorithm. So while I cannot give you right now something that where we like have a problem ready with all the training data, there's a lot of like possibilities. And actually, just last week, I had a bachelor student starting and finding pathologies in X-ray diffraction data of macromolecules with, well, he starts out with scikit-learn. So these must be very baseline for the listeners of ELLIS, right? So there's a lot of potential, and a structural biology community, we have just started to come together over the last 2 years to focus more and more in this area.
Mm-hmm. What would be the best way to get involved? So should they just write you an email and see how you can collaborate? That's the way to go?
Yep, just write me an email. We're available. I may forward it to someone from my team who's better suited to the question. But so far, we are not at capacity with the emails we get in terms of answering them.
Yes, okay, great, thanks. So Vincent, you had a question? Maybe to
Yeah.
Mark or to
Yeah,
Frank?
so I think it could be Mark or Frank. So very vaguely, my understanding was that once a COVID patient shows symptoms, like their immune system is already very active, and so they might be already kind of close to the peak in like virus levels. So I was wondering, like, how early do you have to administer an antiviral drug for it to have the maximum effect?
Do you want me to take that one? Yeah, I guess that is a difficult question to answer. Obviously, the earlier the better. I guess we haven't done the models to say exactly how early you need to do it. Obviously, there are different approaches to try and inhibit. Small molecule is, I guess, once the virus is present, then to try and stop the damage it causes. But how early? I guess it's yeah. I can't give you a definitive answer, I guess, but the earlier the better. And I said that, you know, that there are other causes of treatment, antibody or vaccine, I guess. But with the antiviral, yeah, that is one of the downfalls, I guess, of it is when you administer and how much disease you can eradicate before it escalates.
Frank, you have any?
Yeah, I would also say so anything that tries to inhibit virus entry or replication of the virus, so anything that targets the population of the virus should be done rather early, because in the early stages you can then reduce the problems that you'll have later. Later in this, if the disease gets really bad, the immune system itself is part of the problem. Like there's an overreaction of the immune system, and then it gets really, really tricky. The good thing, in a sense, is that so when you have first symptoms and you get a test, and you usually have a bit of time until it gets really bad, and where reducing the virus load can be effective. And also, whatever you do there therapeutically, you really need to do it only for like a week or two. So that means you're not exposing the patient to a drug that might not be perfectly made for this particular disease and may have side effects if you take it for a longer time, because you essentially just try to do whatever you can to reduce the virus load for a week or two. And then you could even maybe give a high dose of a drug that otherwise you wouldn't do if you were to give this drug for half a year or something like that.
Yeah. Good. Okay, I have one more question to Mark. So you get submissions, right? So and you, I guess, collect these submissions, and then maybe some of them are tested. So what's your algorithm, or what's your procedure of going? I don't know how many submissions you get and how many you can actually test. So can you test all of the submissions, or is there an algorithm picking them, and what's the strategy?
Yeah, so we can't test everything. So of the 5,000 ideas, so the way that it's been working so far is we'll have kind of specific waves or specific questions we want to ask. So maybe it will be just covalent inhibitors, or non-covalent related to a fragment, or non-covalent related to a non-fragment. And then it's a case of kind of mining the submitted compounds to look for the compounds that fulfill that criteria. So we have multiple computational chemists running, you know, different models, docking, MD, for energy perturbation. That's where things like machine learning models could come in to help prioritize. So the idea is to get a priority ranked list of compounds. So synthetic accessibility is another criteria, because we want to get the compounds that are of most interest, that are quickest to synthesize through first. So the compounds are synthesized at a contract research organization. So enamine, so they synthesize the molecule, so they have to be synthetically accessible to get the throughput fast enough. So we employ various computational methods, as the medicinal chemists on the team will look at, you know, functional groups and chemists feel for what they think might work. But any sort of computational method, ADME tox models, anything like that we can use to focus in on the most appropriate compounds for a given challenge or task that we're trying to address with a set of compounds. That's how we select.
Yeah. I mean, to a certain extent, I wonder. I mean, one could say that submitters submitted to you, it's a bit of black box when it's never tested. So it could be nice to have a feedback loop where there's some. I don't know, when you do some quality checking, you find whatever that it can't work, and you give that as a feedback to the submissions. That could be useful.
Yeah, I think the feedback is important, and that will be definitely tried. So anything that is selected or isn't selected, to feed that back to obviously people spending their time creating design ideas. And some of the design ideas people will have run through kind of quite elaborate models and assessment prior to upload. So that needs to be taken into account as well. But yeah, I agree that for crowdsourcing to work, to keep people enthused, and you need to give them the feedback on, if your compound's been selected and synthesized, feed that, and if it hasn't been, then feed that back as well, and reasons why. So we try to do that as well.
Yeah, great. Yeah, that would be great. Good. Are there other questions in the audience here? So I don't have any further questions online at the moment. So if not, then maybe let me share my screen again. Just a second. So, oops. Can you see my screen? Yes. Okay. So yeah, with that, I would like to maybe thank all the speakers, thank the audience for participating, for asking questions. So we will have the next edition of this workshop likely on June 10th. So this will be again based on proposals for speakers and topics. Please send them to Daniela. Also remember, if you have machine learning work related to COVID, please consider sending it to NeurIPS. And yeah, with that, I would like to conclude this meeting. Is there anybody else who wants to say something? Seb, Bernard? If not, then thank you all for participating, and see you next time. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Bye. Thanks.